welcome, Sarah. Thank you so much for coming. It's lovely to see you again. Last time I think we met in the office in London, and it probably was a year ago, was it?
I know, I think it was before lockdown, for sure.
And you're up in Edinburgh. Would you like to just give people a little bit of a background about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, of course. So my name's Sarah McGeown, and I'm a senior lecturer in developmental psychology at the University of Edinburgh. I've been carrying out research into children and adolescents reading development for the last 15 years or so, and a lot of my research focuses on either early reading instruction, so looking at the most effective ways to teach children to read, or on promoting reading for pleasure among older primary school children and secondary school pupils as well. And I've got a particular interest in trying to connect research with practice. So I work a lot with teachers and with school children to conduct my research as well, just to make sure that the work that I'm doing is sort of relevant and meaningful to those working with children.
And so we recently released with Sarah, and Sarah was obviously our main contributor to the Reading Enjoyment Guide. And just before we start sort of talking more widely around reading, I wondered if you'd like to make any comments or observations, Sarah, about that experience and where that sort of came from.
I think for me it's really important for teachers to have access to research which is being carried out within the field, because there's a huge body of academic research which really is untouched often by teachers. And so it's really, I really like this idea of kind of making the research appear more kind of relevant and putting it in a way which is sort of relevant, I guess, for teachers too. So I guess when we spoke about developing the guide, my motivation for getting involved was really this opportunity to share research with teachers and for teachers to feel more sort of confident about the practice that they're doing, but also to be able to adjust their teaching based on the knowledge of the students that they're working with as well.
Unlike maths and writing, where you can see how a children's doing and whether they get it or whether they understand what they're supposed to be understanding. Reading is so different, isn't it? It's this unknown. They're sitting with a book in front of them. And how do teachers encourage that, do you think? What do you think what's the blueprint to get children reading?
So I suppose in the work that I've been doing over the last couple of years, I've been thinking about the sort of principles that teachers can think about in order to support reading for pleasure. And some of them are just very basic ideas, such as making sure that children have access to a range of texts which are relevant to their interests, that they're keeping up to date with recent trends, just to make sure that children are able to access texts that align with their interests. I also think time is really important as well, so making sure that there's time within the school day for children to read for pleasure, and this isn't sort of deconstructing passages of text. This is actually just reading and getting that kind of immersive experience that you often get within books. And I think choice is really important too. So making sure that students have choice over the reading activities that they have. We know ourselves when we go to a bookshop, we don't like someone else to choose our own books. We like to choose them for ourselves. So I think choice is really important. And some students are in a better position, I suppose, to make good reading choices than others. Those students who are more experienced readers, who maybe know their own reading interests better, they're familiar with different series or authors or genres. And these students are maybe in a stronger position to make good reading choices. So sometimes teachers may need to support some students with choice. So there's the kind of access, choice and time, which I think are kind of really important underpinning principles. But in terms of other ones as well, I think success is really important for reading for pleasure, because students need to have successful reading experiences in order to want to continue to read. And success can be considered in terms of being able to read the words well and being able to read fluently, but it can also be considered in terms of a positive experience, so that they've enjoyed it and they've got a lot out of it too. And I think finally, it's looking at the kind of the relevance of books and texts in children's lives, and being able to make that connection between a child's interests and what they want out of reading and what books are available as well. I think finding that kind of connection is really important. And I've begun to think of reading as a sort of experience. So children are seeking out different experiences. They're either looking to, relax, or they're looking for an immersive experience, or they're looking to laugh or to be thrilled. So making sure that you're able to kind of align what a student's looking for in terms of the experience with the right kind of book can be really helpful. And so knowledge of literature for children and young adults can really help with that as well, to make sure you can make those connections.
I think what you're demonstrating, and what you're talking about, is actually demonstrated with very young children, isn't it? Because those initial stages, it needs to be about enjoyment and about thrills and about fun. And sometimes I worry when I hear parents saying, "Oh, well, we did some reading last night, but it took forever because they were sounding out every word." And thinking, no, that's not reading. That's just not. And you don't have to do that. And it's good to hear that, all of those elements. And in fact, actually, I sit here thinking, gosh, actually, a lot of the customers I've seen here, I recognize a few of them. And I think, well, you've got accelerated reader, and actually that's ticking some of those boxes, making sure it's relevant and at the right level, and there's a choice. So, I mean, that's lovely to hear. In terms of teachers knowing what level their children are at, or pitching the right type of book towards them, what advice would you give there?
Yeah, so I think it's important for teachers to know their students well. And so, for example, the National Literacy Trust, each year they publish their survey of children and young people's reading, and in it they look at group differences. So, for example, differences between boys and girls, or age differences as well. And these show kind of trends in order to kind of help what boys are reading versus what girls are reading, or what different age groups look at. And it can be quite helpful to know this, but it's important to think about each child as an individual, rather than thinking about, this is a girl and so they must like this, or this is a young teenager and so that's what they're interested in reading. So it's important to kind of know your students and know their reading interests, their habits, what they've read previously, and what kind of experience they're looking for from a book in terms of helping them to kind of extend their range of what they're reading. Because one of the problems is that children can get quite focused in on a specific series or author or genre, but thinking a little bit more about reading as an experience and how different genres can offer that kind of experience can be useful too. So I think knowing about pupils is really important. For teachers to know about pupils is really important to know how to support their reading. And then also, as you mentioned, about knowing their skill level as well, and their ability and what type of text they're going to have a successful reading experience with is crucial too.
I think, yes, and sometimes parents need that support too, don't they? They need to feel that they can make some choices, and instead of going into maybe Sainsbury's or Waterstones and they're standing there thinking, where on earth do I start? What do I choose? And then pick up 6 books by the same author. Oh, well, they've got one on this author. They like this one. Let's get this one again.
I mean, to be honest, that kind of describes me as a parent. It's like I'm a researcher who says one thing, and I'm a parent. I just realised who does something completely different. But it is. I mean, my children are reading kind of picture books and things, and I don't have a broad knowledge of different types of picture books, and so I tend to go back to the same things again and again. And so I think for teachers, and any sort of resources that they can use to broaden their knowledge of literature can be really helpful actually. And I think peer-to-peer recommendations can be really helpful too. So it's not all on the teacher or parents providing the support, but actually friends also know what their peers are interested in and can provide that advice.
Absolutely. And so struggling readers, for all sorts of reasons, it may be a language, it may be other learning difficulties, it may just be lack of exposure to literature and language in general. What sort of advice would you give there?
I mean, I think it's obviously very important to support struggling readers, and I think the kind of greatest gains that you can make are often among the struggling readers. I mean, typically they've maybe had years of poor reading experiences, and so they may have poor perceptions of themselves as readers, and that can make reading appear to be a really stressful or really boring thing for them. So it's really important to kind of tackle that. I'd say for struggling readers, this issue of access and choice is really important. So making sure that they have access to books which are genuinely going to interest them, but are at the reading level that's required for them to be able to kind of access it fluently, and giving them, supporting them with making good choices too. I think audiobooks can be quite useful as well, because audiobooks give struggling readers this opportunity to hear a book fluently, develop their language skills, get immersed within a story, without having to necessarily read for themselves. And I think this kind of idea of success is important too. And we can think about success not in terms of sort of achievement, but actually praising student success in terms of their effort and their development as well. And success doesn't necessarily need to mean reading a book fluently. It can also mean trying out a different genre when they maybe hadn't done it previously, or learning the meaning of a new word. And so helping students to see that even if they're struggling readers, they are becoming successful readers as well through the development that they're making. So it doesn't necessarily need to be success at a certain level, it's their own development, and making sure that you're praising that growth and that change that you're seeing within them.
And obviously these days screens are very prevalent and popular. So book reading, why is book reading so important? Let's talk about books.
So if we think about books, I guess compared to other text types, and that we could mean social networking sites or websites and things as well, there's quite a lot of research which has looked at the amount of time that children and young people spend reading books versus engaging with these other text types, whether it's social networking sites, for example. And the research has very consistently showed that children and young people who read more books have better reading and spelling skills, better general knowledge, better language skills as well. So there's a lot of kind of academic benefits, I suppose, associated with reading books. And I suppose one of the benefits of books is that they introduce us to a much more wider, more varied vocabulary than we encounter in everyday conversations. So if you think about the characteristics of spoken language, usually when we're having conversations, we use quite a restricted vocabulary, actually, and we often don't speak in perfectly articulated sentences either, whereas books are characterized by kind of more broader and more varied vocabulary. They have perfectly constructed sentences, clearly articulated trains of thought, and so they're introducing children to this kind of book language, which is actually really beneficial for them compared to when we think about it in comparison with spoken language. So I think books are beneficial in terms of reading development, spelling, general knowledge, language development. But as I said, I've been come to thinking of reading as a kind of experience as well, and the sort of emotional experiences that books provide too. And in some of our recent research, we've been asking children about their kind of experiences with books and how books make them feel. And it's really wonderful to hear from their perspectives the types of experiences that they're having. So things such as I said earlier, they're reading to laugh or to spend time with their fictional friends, or for escapism, or to get immersed in a story, or to pursue their interests. And so books provide not just these academic benefits, but also these emotional experiences. But in order to achieve these, it's all about connecting children with the right books. So the books that are going to develop their language skills and their literacy skills, and that are going to give them these experiences that really resonate with them. And so it's not just about reading books, it's about reading the right type of books for each reader.
And also, just you saying what you were saying, obviously books are a wonderful opportunity to lose oneself, and for parents to help children lose themselves and share that lovely experience. But talk obviously influences the way in which a child can then engage with that text. What they speak or what they've heard obviously influences that too, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, and like, I guess throughout all of this, we've been thinking about reading or discussing reading as a kind of solitary activity where a child's reading by themselves. But actually, a lot of the kind of broader benefits of books come around those extended discussions that you have, whether it's parent to child or teacher to pupil or pupil to pupil kind of discussion, but too. And I think similarly, we can't assume that parents or pupils are really good at having those conversations around books. And so there's work that teachers need to do around kind of modeling or giving prompting questions in order to support those initial discussions, so that they feel confident contributing to discussions about books and sharing their opinions, and things like that as well. So absolutely, I think that kind of extended discussion around books is really really important.
And I was going to ask you about the decline, perhaps, of reading for pleasure with adolescents or as children get older. So it sort of links in. It's around this, adolescent space where reading's probably no longer so cool, and there are other things taking up their time, but widening a teacher's knowledge as well.
Yeah, well, I think, okay, so I guess there's a couple of points there. So the first is that there is clearly a kind of decline in the amount that teenagers say that they read compared to when they're children. I mean, again, the National Literacy Trust, when they publish their large annual survey, you see quite clearly this decline in reading attitudes, but also in daily book reading as well, whereas there's this increase in digital text, whether it's social networking sites or websites. And so it's really important, I suppose, to understand from teenagers' perspectives what it is that they're hoping to get out of a book, or why it is that they're no longer reading. So a couple of years ago, we carried out a project which was called Growing Up a Reader. And this was actually a collaboration with primary school students and secondary school students. And they interviewed their peers about why they read and why they don't read. And from that, we actually have another study, which has just started this year, which is called Tackling the Drop-Off, and it's about understanding the teenage reading experience and how we can encourage more teenagers to read. But when teenagers spoke about why they no longer read in kind of secondary schools, some of them said they simply didn't know why. They used to be quite avid readers. It stopped at some point, but they don't know, they couldn't actually say why that has happened. Other ones spoke about the fact that when you're a teenager, books are actually very thick, they're quite big compared to when you're a child. And so they saw books as being a big commitment, and they're too much of a commitment. And I hadn't really seen it from that perspective before, but for a teenager, a book is quite a chunky, big length of time that they have to commit to something. And they also spoke about finding it difficult or harder to find books than necessarily content on their phones, because they said, when you have your phone with you all the time, personalized things just pop up all the time. And so it's really easy for them to access things like that. Whereas finding a book, especially if you haven't read in a while, that can be quite a lot of effort, and that can be something which is quite difficult to do. So there were other things as well about, reading not necessarily being cool anymore, about not necessarily having the time, about other activities being more important. Some students said that they were encouraged to read in primary school, encouraged to read for pleasure in primary school, but actually it wasn't suggested in secondary school that they read for pleasure. And if they were encouraged to do so, they might actually do it as well. So I think there's a lot that we can learn from listening to teenagers about what the issues are in the adolescent period and why they're not necessarily connecting with books. I think for teachers who are interested in understanding more about young adults literature, I know Teresa Kremen does a lot of work around kind of teacher reading groups, which is about sort of celebrating, it's mostly children's literature, I have to say, it's mostly about kind of celebrating children's literature and raising teachers' awareness of the kind of the richness and variety of literature that's available for children. So I know that there are kind of reading groups around that, but if there's nothing for young adult literature, then I'd suggest that teachers consider creating groups themselves and sharing knowledge in that way, or looking at different organisations where they have, different types of young adult literature, or the What Kids Are Reading report, where you can see the most kind of popular books which are being read as well. So I completely appreciate that it's a challenge for teachers to keep up to date with young adult literature, and I think the variety of what's available is probably more than for children as well. So it is a challenge. And I think if there are resources to support teachers, like the report that I mentioned, or if teachers can support each other in that, I think that's incredibly important, yeah.
And I think one of the things that I'm interested in as well, even though I'm no longer in the classroom, I don't think I'll ever lose that enjoyment of choosing books. And I'm a granny now, so I'm revisiting titles that I shared with my own children. Is, you know, how can we get more information? What sort of research is there out there that's easily digestible? And I don't mean that's because we're not intelligent. I mean that we can get some pinpoints that we can say, oh, that's a great idea. Have you got any suggestions there?
Yeah, no, I completely understand. I mean, as a researcher, I tend to write a lot of articles for journal articles, and I'm aware that teachers are just far too busy to spend the time, you know, looking at reading journal articles. And there's also issues with access as well, so teachers are just unable to access it too. And so again, I mean, I'll refer to the National Literacy Trust research reports as well, because they do carry out a lot of kind of larger scale surveys looking at a wide range, I guess, of things to do with students' reading attitudes, confidence, struggling readers, etc., etc. In last year, we just created a network, so it's LALCO, which stands for Language and Literacy Communication Collaboration Co-Production. And what we're doing at the moment, we've just got funding to start creating resources in order to share research more widely with teachers. And I'm really excited about the opportunity to do this, but I think at the same time, teachers will often ask me questions and assume that there's research to kind of support. So someone asked me recently about reading corners and whether reading corners were effective. And I mean, so many primary school classrooms have reading corners, and yet there's no research which has looked at it. So I'm also very aware of the fact that there's often a disconnect between what researchers are researching and writing up in the literature and what teachers are actually interested in terms of supporting their practice or understanding how to support their students. And so in addition to kind of sharing research and thinking about how research can inform practice, my research approach is also to involve, as I said before, teachers and children in the research process to make sure that we're asking the right questions and that our research is going to be important to someone afterwards as well. So yeah, I think in terms of how teachers can access research to support the practice, I guess the National Literacy Trust is a good one. I know the research-rich pedagogy site by the Open University, that's a good one as well. On the LALCO page, we have quite a bit too, and we'll be adding more as well. But I think teachers should also think about getting more involved in research too, and that might just be contacting the local university and saying that they'd be interested to get involved in research, not as, you know, participants where we're just doing research in your classrooms, but actually about involving teachers' pedagogical knowledge and expertise to inform the research that we're carrying out as well. And researchers always love to hear from teachers who are kind of more interested in engaging in the work that we're doing as well.
I was reading something the other day about the importance of teachers reading aloud to children, and also about sort of questioning children about texts in the classroom. So it sort of lends itself to the whole class guided reading approach and the more sort of general. When I was teaching, we had this dreadful carousel, which used to be, I used to find terrible. You do all this planning for 6 groups and only spent time with one at a time, and the others were sort of holding in the background while supposedly doing something literacy biased. And I just wondered if you had any experience of that whole class reading and you know, facilitating that really to make sure it adds value.
Yeah, I mean, I think when teachers are reading aloud to a whole class, obviously there's the opportunity for children to access that book as it's kind of read to them fluently and to sort of all engage in that kind of experience together. And they can hear the teacher's sort of intonation and the expression that they're putting into it as well. So it sort of models what that might look like when they're kind of reading themselves. I think for me, it's it's really difficult sometimes to say what practices work and don't work, because teachers are working in such completely different contexts and supporting such different students too. And I think that if teachers have an understanding of the kind of underpinning research and the kind of the theory behind literacy development, for example, then they're in a much better position to be able to understand what practices are going to work for them. Because I have seen some practices working well in some contexts and not necessarily working well within others. I know the Education Endowment Foundation, for example, as well, they also publish kind of reports of, I think they have one on reciprocal reading. So you can learn a little bit more about kind of common classroom practices and evaluations of them through them. But a lot of it does come down to, like I said, the context, the students that you're supporting, the teachers' knowledge and attitudes towards the approach that they're delivering as well. And if teachers are really enthusiastic and really behind what they're being asked to do, then you see a difference than if it's kind of a very reluctant approach as well. So I think teachers ultimately need to be the sort of decision makers if they're putting into place additional practices about what they think is going to be best for their students.
I mean, getting children to write about what they're reading can also seem like a great idea, but it can also be the kiss of death, can't it? Because if I've got to write reams on a book, I'm going to read a short book, because why would I not? And I know children would think like that.
Yeah, I mean, reading and writing are very similar skills in a lot of ways, but they're also very different skills too. I mean, reading is by far the easier thing, because reading simply requires recognition and reading of something that's already there, whereas writing requires the production of something. And so it's not just about spelling skill and grammar, it's also about your expression of ideas and your ability to kind of articulate your own ideas too. And so I suppose it just depends from student to student in terms of how confident students are in their writing to be able to express themselves like that afterwards.
There's nothing much more for me to say than thank you so much for giving up your time, for your expertise, for the guide. I mean, we're really thrilled with the guide. If you haven't seen it yet, please, when you get the link, make sure, you give it a glance. There's someone here saying, thank you so much. It's been so helpful in tackling with SLT. So sometimes, you need evidence and you need information to help support your argument too, because people don't always know what they don't know, do they?
Yeah. No, I agree. I think getting the school leadership teams on board is really important in terms of them recognising the importance of reading for pleasure. And of course, if students are reading for pleasure in the classroom, the idea is hopefully that they're extending that to home as well, so that you've got these kind of added benefits of reading at home too. So I hope that it's I hope that this does kind of provide some fuel when you're kind of speaking to your school leadership team about this.
So thank you very much.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Renaissance Space podcast, please check out the Education Joining the Dots podcast from our colleagues at GL Assessment. Thank you.